So what are they to do now? Trudeau, Mulroney, and now the current Prime Minister, Chrétien, who I might add was a former Indian Affairs Minister, have all contributed to the land lust of corporations and ordinary Canadians, thus legitimizing the anti-Indian movement from the very outset. Now, for those of you who are aware of what I'm calling the anti-Indian movement, I hope you're a little clear, at least as an outsider observing, what I see about the origins of this phenomenon. And now, I turn to the question of the collapse of the Soviet Union. It unleashed mindless, predatory capitalism. Adam Smith, they said, won, not Karl Marx. A simplification, admittedly, but a profoundly influential statement. Because what it said in governments like that in Ottawa, or that in Washington, or that in Paris, was that now corporations, the engines of capitalism, can now define the priorities of all of these societies, and government will become the aid and assistant. And we have seen just that. So, rather than starting the anti-Indian movement, the collapse of the Soviet Union accelerates it. It didn't make any difference which one won the Cold War. They both Marx and his people and Smith and his raped the earth and killed the nations equally. We found this to be true after the collapse of the Soviet Union, where 150 non-Russian nations were exposed to the world suddenly. We know one of them now appears periodically in the newspapers, called Chechnya. It was 750,000 people. It's not now that number. What's at stake in Chechnya? Why is there such a war of deadly force? Land and oil is the answer. The symbolic winning of the Cold War created the impression that capitalism won and could now give power to the big businesses and transnational corporations, and now they would rule, and everyone would be a capitalist and everyone's a businessman, or woman as the case may be. And now water usage would go up, oil and fossil fuel usage would go up, wood products, bauxite, aluminum, copper, precious metals, corporate farming and forest farming and range and ocean farming would all now be done. The conversion of people from diverse cultures all over the world was now to produce a monoculture of consumers. I hope you're feeling good so far. Non-Indian country is convinced that it will benefit from an economy run by corporate CEOs. Others want theirs, thus the land rush and the corporate control. That is, if I have my own individual wants, I'm going to try to get my wants before you get your wants, and thus the land rush. But I don't mind that the corporation might control as long as I have mine. So, it is in these two ways that the actions of Pierre Trudeau in 1970 and then subsequently the decision to make a formal Canada in 1982 created the anti-Indian movement, and then the Soviet Union, collapsing into a morass, produced an accelerated pace of expanded use of raw materials and land destruction. So everyone can be happy, so the theory is. Now, let me ask you the question, why is it that the anti-Indian movement might be considered a disaster that will seek to wreak havoc for Indians now, but ordinary Canadians later? You recall my several points earlier when I mentioned the food issues brought up by the Food and Agricultural Organization about the shortages or the breakdown of some of the genetic stock in wheat and rice and potatoes and corn. The only source for those raw materials were in First Nations. And they are the only sources of nutrition for all of the human race. The world decided after 1945 that there was such a potential disaster coming about the loss of seed that they set up food, that is seed banks. And they went out among people all over the world and collected wild seed. And they were doing this because they were looking to the future that one day they would have to find seeds to produce new foods from old seed. But unfortunately, virtually every country, including this one, with a food or seed bank, has failed to fund the preservation of the seed banks, and the refrigeration units have broken down more often than not, and the seeds have rotted. And the seeds on which we, the human race, would want to depend no longer exist. And you say, well, no problème. We'll just invent some more. I might point out to you that not a single grain has been invented in 6,000 years. It was all done before we had microscopes. And no one knows how it's done. But there are a few people who still plant with wild seed. And they live in these First Nations, like in the Sarawak forest that is now gone. That affects you and me every day, and it will affect us more. And it will affect our children and our grandchildren and our grandchildren's grandchildren, and perhaps no more. Now, that's apocalyptic, I admit, but I didn't write the Food and Agriculture Organization report. I'm only telling you what it said, and I'm only telling you that the information reveals that the people who are responsible for caretaking of the wild seed are themselves being rubbed out. And so we have a false sense of security when we sit back and say, oh, that isn't my problem. That is unimportant. But now the people who are responsible for breaking down many of these nations are in your own backyard because they want theirs and they want it now. They want their own patch and they would like to get some irradiated seeds and plant something there now. They have short-term goals. If we fail to have our long-term goals in mind, then we won't have grandchildren. Now, what must be done? Indian nations themselves, in Canada, as in the United States and throughout this hemisphere, and even the Panan, have themselves a duty and responsibility to their place. And I must say, many of them are failing. They are failing to fulfill their own obligation that they know to be true. And I'm not going to apologize for their failure. I'm simply going to point it out. But they don't need to fail if we, among ourselves, decide that perhaps their failure will also be ours, and that it is perhaps in our best interest that they not fail. We could develop and execute plans to help non-Indians who are trapped